Total War has had a rich and complicated history with DLCs. There have been unit packs and faction packs, cosmetic packs, even just to introduce blood effects, and of course full-fledged expansions over the course of the franchise's history. It's the latter that has since been few and far between. In recent years, with the franchise's direction into the Warhammer universe and away from its historical roots, we've seen less and less of an emphasis on full-bodied content packs that have dramatically transformed their respective main titles. And so it's worth it to take a look back at the major Total War expansions that have resonated in our memory. In this video, we'll go back 10 years to when a major standalone expansion for Shogun 2 ended up becoming so defining it has eclipsed the legacy of its base game, bridging the gap between new and old, and still so playable and moddable that it has re-emerged into the fan base conscience as a premier historical Total War experience. This is a 10-year retrospective of a Total War saga, Fall of the Samurai. Total War Shogun 2 released in March of 2011, a sequel to Total War's first ever title. Set in 16th century feudal Japan, the game presents an intimate focus of the Sengoku period, a period that saw near constant civil wars and political, social instability. It was significant in that for more than a decade, ever since the release of the first Shogun Total War, the franchise had been exclusively Eurocentric, with the Roman, medieval, and Enlightenment ages covered previously. Immediately before Shogun 2 was the double release of the hugely successful Empire and Napoleon Total War, built on similar iterations of the Warscape engine, and two titles which established gunpowder warfare as the dominant gameplay style of the Total War series at the time, portraying line infantry and artillery battles that allowed players to execute nuanced tactics. The depiction of Total War's only naval battles to date, combined with expansive and detailed campaign maps, Empire and Napoleon Total War was in some ways the defining gateway Total War, and represented economic and player growth success for the franchise. With this return to a Japanese setting, Creative Assembly was also returning to the sword and arrow combat that defined its military style in earlier titles, but brought it up to contemporary graphical standards with Empire and Napoleon's iteration of the Warscape engine. Shogun 2 was a much tighter focus, but it allowed exposition into a foreign East Asian theme with a lot of aesthetic depth, polish, and charm, giving Western audiences a more niche experience in a time period and location they may have been unfamiliar with, whilst at the same time hoping to broaden the player base. Building on a decade's worth of experience and gameplay amalgamation, Creative Assembly delivered the series' most refined mechanics and systems into Shogun 2. It has been regarded as one of the best Total War games ever made, consistently scoring highly in media outlet rankings and maintaining exceptional user scores well after its 10-year anniversary. Fall of the Samurai was built upon this strong foundation, and so the many positives of the Shogun 2 platform has assisted in the perception of the expansion itself. It is of my opinion that Shogun 2 had one of Total War's better economic systems, a result of years and years of refining the Empire and Napoleon Total War system. The simulation of provincial growth and decline as a result of policy, unrest and devastation, and a trade system with a greater emphasis on commodities have either been streamlined, dumbed down, or even removed entirely in newer Total Wars. Shogun 2 was also the last Total War to feature minor towns or settlements outside of provincial capitals. This allowed armies to interdict the economy directly, cutting off trade by sacking a port, shutting down income by attacking farms or mines. This entire system changed hereafter, starting with Rome 2, which introduced the region and province system, multiple regions with cities constituting one province with a major capital, without any minor or separated settlements or towns. From a gameplay perspective, this change has definitely streamlined the campaign of later Total Wars, but at the same time, it's also reduced the depth that hasn't really been experienced since Shogun 2. This Total War was also the first one that drastically improved the character system, introducing skill trees and personality traits that have since been taken for granted, appearing in every Total War since. But it's important to note that this was the title that brought these mechanics into the limelight. Shogun 2 featured a dishonor system which judges your daimyo's honor according to the samurai code. Looting cities, betraying allies, and other lecherous acts negatively impacts perception of not only your faction but the daimyo himself. Looting cities especially is something that is so unpunished and forsaken in later Total War games, it's often the preferred way to make money. Other Shogun 2 specific mechanics such as defection and surrender were also possible as a result of this system. Although these mechanics have been reinterpreted as things like the loyalty system in later Total War titles, the last time it was with considerable depth and synergy was within Shogun 2. The game also reintroduced the family tree, a system which has been implemented on and off in Total War's history, appearing in the Rome and Medieval editions but removed from the more governmental Empire and Napoleon titles. Familial relationships play an important role in Japanese society, and so Shogun 2 delivers a much more intimate family focus, which has since only been replicated and improved upon in the recent Total War 3 Kingdoms. Shogun 2 was also the final Total War game with the detached military system, where armies could be combined and separated at will, allowing the possibility of multiple generals per army, detached units, leaderless garrisons, and non-restrictive recruitment. With Rome 2, Total War has forever changed to an army system that fundamentally revolves around individualized generals, whereupon generals must be recruited first, and all recruitment runs through their respective armies. It's a design decision aimed at streamlining gameplay, but reduces the nuance, particularly in historical context, as many historical armies often saw multiple generals leading separate flanks. And with detachable units, you could send raiding parties to attack minor settlements, send cavalry to scout ahead of the main army, or reinforce a distant siege, or a host of other creative and intricate campaign maneuvers impossible with newer editions of Total War. With this retrospect in mind, it is, of my opinion, Shogun 2 represents a bridge between this older, more complex, but more challenging Total War, and the newer, more modern, more streamlined Total War. And so when we look back on Shogun 2 and Fall of the Samurai, we're also peering into the previous generation of Total War games, before the franchise has in a sense matured into a more casualized establishment. Total War Shogun 2 was also the first Total War with full Steam Workshop support for mods. Previous Total Wars required users to sift through Total War Center's archaic forums to find and download mods hosted on third-party websites, but with the Steam Workshop and an integrated mod launcher, the first such tool in the series, Shogun 2 represented a huge leap in Total War modability, even if it was all very primitive and nothing like the modern Total War launcher. This has culminated in a persistent player base of new and returning players as mods continuously sprout up, enhanced by the fact that East Asian modding communities have also begun exploring Shogun 2 as the exposure of Total War into foreign markets continue. The eccentric art style and unit design lends itself well to customization. Modding tools have matured greatly, and the game's systems can be edited to a much higher degree than other Total Wars. For instance, even the campaign map can be changed with new cities and regions being added. And it has to be said, Shogun 2 still plays exceptionally well. Unlike previous titles which have begun to show their age, and are in some regards unplayable, such as Napoleon Total War literally being unlaunchable on 12th generation Alder Lake and later Intel chips, Shogun 2 still retains a surprising amount of graphical quality, compatibility, and performance optimization to run on many systems, old or new. Shogun 2, with its art style, its presentation, its music, and solid gameplay elements, lands itself into a certain charm that has no doubt earned great reverence as one of the best and continuously popular historical Total War titles. Total War Shogun 2 received much DLC support beginning right after launch. Indeed, it was somewhat infamous for starting the Total War trend of blood packs. allowing the base game to skirt into a parental guidance rating by paywall locking blood and dismemberment effects into a separate DLC. Conceptually, a major expansion covering separate Total War campaigns was not new in the series. Stretching back to Rome Total War, we saw the Barbarian Invasion and Alexander expansions. In Medieval 2, we saw Kingdoms. In Empire, we saw Warpath. And Napoleon, the Peninsula campaign, all bringing an adjusted timeline and adjusted campaign map to focus on a similar subject matter. As a result, each of these expansion packs were not vastly divergent from the base game. The Rome Total War expansions focused on a prologue and epilogue to the Roman age, Medieval 2's was still medieval, and the Empire Napoleon DLCs were more intimate snapshots within their own historical context. Fall of the Samurai is a huge break from base game Shogun 2, however. Sure, it's still set in Japan, but that's as far as the similarities lie. Fall of the Samurai depicts the Boshin War period, more than 300 years after the events of the base game Sengoku period, the largest time period discrepancy seen in a Total War DLC, and it will not be replicated until Total War Attila. Historically, the Boshin War resulted in the Meiji Restoration, a time of immense technological and socio-political disruption in Japan that saw the nation become industrialized, witnessing a huge cultural and military shift that resultingly echoes into massive changes on the Total War battlefield and campaign map, to the point where it feels and plays like an entirely different game. In the grand campaign, Fall of the Samurai executes the balancing scale game design intricately, forcing the player to weave a constant fine line between two counterweights. There's several of these opposing counterweights. There's the direct conflict between the ruling shogunate and the rebelling imperial forces, and so players have to choose which side to pick as their main objective in the faction selection screen. But there's a more indirect struggle between modernization and traditionalism. This is a time of immense change in Japan, with the onset of trade with the Western powers, the nationwide industrialization effort, and mass adoption of gunpowder weapons. Players must also dictate their clan's future in the land of the rising sun. Modernize too fast and you risk destabilizing your realm. Stay too traditional and you risk falling behind technologically against your rivals. Militarily, many factions are also staunch conservatives, refusing to field modern equipment in large numbers, whilst bitterly enduring with the samurai code of honor. Other factions openly embrace Western developments in warfare, utilizing contemporary artillery batteries and line infantry tactics. And so there's a keen sense of a greater, overarching role-playing experience in Fall of the Samurai. You can roleplay as the traditionalist trying to save the way of the samurai, using superior discipline, fervor, and sometimes just raw numbers to overwhelm enemies. Or you can fully embrace the effectiveness of smoke and powder to shatter opponents at range with devastating fire. This makes Fall of the Samurai a literal crossroads, a melting pot between the base game's more melee-oriented samurai units and the two preceding gunpowder Total Wars in Empire and Napoleon. Although the base game did feature some matchlock muskets and cannons, their primitiveness at this stage in history limits their overall effectiveness, and their low availability meant they were only a small component of the Sengoku armies. By the time of Fall of the Samurai, line infantry become the mainstay of the armed forces, with conservative magnetism still ensuring that melee-wielding samurai ranks still had a role to play, despite being in their twilight age. And it's not often you can pit the British Royal Marines against the samurai. And on the battlefield is where Fall of the Samurai truly shines. Polished visuals, a lush audioscape, and visceral effects, building on the atmosphere of Napoleon Total War, makes the dramatic clash between samurai and riflemen all the more breathtaking. Tactically, Fall of the Samurai opened up immense creative potential for commanders as it infused all the generations of melee infantry, line infantry, artillery, and cavalry tactics of all the previous Total War games into a fusion that offers variety and replayability in spades. There's a certain charm in seeing rifle-equipped infantry volleying thick smoke in disciplined lines of formation, only to be rushed into a close-quarters brawl by naginata-wielding samurai laden with armor, only for them to be blasted into smithereens by long-range cannon fire. There's something quite sad about it all as well, with the advent of such weapons capable of racking up hundreds of kills in mere instances. Fall of the Samurai is able to also depict the sheer brutality that was accelerating with modern warfare, something that is usually more apparent in later conflicts. Seeing samurai get torn to shreds by Gatling guns was disheartening yet eye-opening, and harkens back to tales such as Polish lancers charging German tanks in World War II, even if they were just myths. The sense of gallantry in the face of technological inferiority is a common theme in Fall of the Samurai, and it gives emotional impetus for players to sympathize with the samurai cause. It is of my opinion that Fall of the Samurai also had the best naval gameplay of any Total War ever, equally as influential on the campaign map as it is thunderous in battle. With the advent of steamships and mid-19th century naval guns, Fall of the Samurai contains the most modern depiction of naval warfare available in a Total War setting, which makes it quite a unique selling point of the expansion, bridging the gap between ship of the line and ironclad gunboat tactics with a sprinkling of explosive and sometimes catastrophic potential. This expansion makes naval battles a historically weak component of Total War games, it has to be said. Not only bearable, but enjoyable. Navies are pronounced for the fact that they can influence the campaign and land-based battles as well, with the distinct naval bombardment mechanic exclusive to Fall of the Samurai. Ships can bombard land targets, buildings, and armies, as well as deliver devastating ground support in land battles. As a result, instead of just being a side theatre on the campaign map, navies become a crucial cog of the entire military machine. With modern Total War titles moving away from naval gameplay entirely, there is indeed a certain degree of nostalgia, but there's no denying Fall of the Samurai represented the absolute peak of Total War's brief love affair with the sea. Finally, and not to understate its importance, was Shogun 2's addition of the first-person camera. This included a manual control feature for Fall of the Samurai's artillery pieces, the first time such features were added into the series, offering a very unique yet sobering perspective into the conflict. Later Total Wars have slowly phased out the first-person camera, which is surprising as it offered an unparalleled viewpoint into the games for taking screenshots and recording footage, or simply immersing oneself in the action. It broke the fourth wall per se. In terms of being able to depict the action to the player, it suddenly becomes not just a purely tactical game viewed solely from the bird's eye perspective, but a down-to-earth examination of early modern warfare. Fall of the Samurai offers so much of a unique Total War experience, it was no wonder it was released as a separate standalone. It tugged upon everything great about Total War up to that point, and added a defining layer of polish and refinement the series has struggled to replicate. Loading in Empire Napoleon's gunpowder action, a grasp of Total War's best features, an innovative insight into new mechanics, a sprinkling of Japanese charm into the refined barrel that was Shogun 2's platform. Fall of the Samurai fired one hell of an impactful shot. Fall of the Samurai has flourished in its legacy as a highly memorable Total War experience due to a variety of other factors that have since been more recognizable over the past 10 years. The first key factor is that, quite simply, no Total War DLC since has been able to replicate the sheer ambition, scope and replayability of Fall of the Samurai, although not for lack of trying. Rome 2 Total War, Creative Assembly's next title after Shogun 2, featured 6 major expansions that also each explored new campaign maps, but these were still anchored within the ancient context of Rome 2 and offered little difference in gameplay. The next Total War, Attila, toned down the quantity of DLCs in a step towards more qualitative releases. As a result, many considered the campaign packs in Attila reminiscent of Creative Assembly's effort to emulate Fall of the Samurai. Of particular note was the Age of Charlemagne expansion. Set almost 400 years after the base game timeline, Age of Charlemagne ferried the setting from the fall of the Roman Empire into a unique early medieval scope, exploring the rise of the namesake Frankish king that would establish the Holy Roman Empire and dominate the politics of the Middle Ages. New gameplay mechanics on a richly detailed campaign map were not able to overcome its poor balance and lack of polish, however, and for the most part, battles still played out exactly the same as Attila's system. Around this time, with the franchise's entry into the Warhammer Fantasy universe, Total War departed from developing major expansions to instead adopt the DLC model we are familiar today, with cheaper but more numerous DLCs aimed at bite-sized chunks of variety rather than large sweeping ambitiousness. Settings that were deemed too small for their own separate mainline game but too large for a DLC were now reserved for an entirely new series in Total War Sagas, with the first, Thrones of Britannia, releasing in 2018. With this marketing push, Fall of the Samurai as a standalone expansion was also rebranded as a Total War Saga. With more Saga installments, however, such as the recent Troy, this spin-off series has commercially flunked and never received much attention from fans. As a result, Fall of the Samurai is a beacon of light within this estranged breakaway project, but it's important to note that it wasn't initially a saga and instead was produced as a major expansion of Shogun 2. So many in the community see Fall of the Samurai, and Shogun 2 for that matter, as one of the last Total Wars before widespread commercialization and casualization has latched onto the series. Modern Total War DLCs echo a general trend occurring across the strategy game market. Content packs that usually feature a faction, a few leaders or heroes, and several new units. For around $10 a pop, they can be mass-produced and represent far greater profit per work hours for the company than $20 or $25 expansion packs. Some minor timeline differences, such as in Total War 3 Kingdoms expansions, which depicted prequel and sequel stories several years before and after, were as far as the developers were willing to differentiate. Total War Sagas, on the other hand, try to sell expansion-like content for almost the same price as mainline games. Thrones of Britannia, for instance, felt like an expansion of Total War Attila, whilst Troy revealed the studio's apathy on the subject matter, offloaded instead to a subsidiary developer. The massive campaign expansions with dedicated historical focuses are definitively a thing of the past because they simply just don't make economic sense compared to the new DLC model and can't seem to succeed by themselves in the Saga model. And so there is this lingering sense of nostalgia with how Creative Assembly operated a decade ago. Besides the extremely popular and successful Warhammer franchise, everywhere else, Total War is caught in a crossroads of sorts, with devs and fans seemingly not knowing where to venture next. In the meanwhile, Fall of the Samurai has seen a resurgence in popularity. As the series attracts new fans, they themselves have begun to explore previous Total War games. Consistently, Fall of the Samurai is at the top of the recommended list. Despite its age, it has kept up moderately well with modern Total Wars on account of its strong modding community. Shogun 2 saw the emergence of the Radius modding team that has modded every Total War since. It was the last game to feature DarthMod, a modding project that is still considered one of the quintessential go-to installs for any gunpowder Total War. Fall of the Samurai has attracted somewhat of a cult following for its moddability. Consider the fact that because Fall of the Samurai not only features crisp melee warfare but also gunpowder in artillery, muskets and naval cannons, there is a huge variety of things to mod. As a result, Fall of the Samurai and Shogun 2 as well are both still extremely playable, and I see myself returning occasionally every year just to check out new modded content. We have seen in recent years the bridging of the Western strategy market and the East Asian player base, especially in Total War. It began with Shogun 2 and has peaked with the recent Total War 3 Kingdoms. Western audiences also tend to enjoy depictions of, and perhaps even glorify to some degree, samurai culture, and there is an increasing interest in Japanese history, whether that be the samurai's apex in the Sengoku period, or its modern history beginning with the Meiji Restoration. It's actually an astute setting to portray, as the political background to the Boshin War involved the United States. Navy Commodore Matthew C. Perry's famous expedition is typically seen as a precursor event that opened up Japan and ended its centuries-long isolationist policy. During the war, the French supported the Shogunate forces, whilst the British supported the Imperialists. This Japanese civil war is in many ways a European proxy war, and it is highlighted in the game with Western units, characters, and mechanics. And so there is also an argument that Fall of the Samurai is a convenient entry point into Japanese history, more so compared to the base game and its other major DLC, Rise of the Samurai. As East meets West in Fall of the Samurai's historical context, so too do Eastern and Western communities converge upon Fall of the Samurai as a common point of interest, an approachable Total War game that is uniquely appealing, charming, and interesting. It's quite poetic, really. Perhaps the real reason why Fall of the Samurai is so loved is because we don't know when, if ever, Total War will return to a gunpowder setting, let alone a historical setting. The Victorian era, or even the Great War, are perhaps too difficult to implement into a Total War framework, considering the complexity and nuance required to effectively portray these later military time periods. So, Fall of the Samurai represents the most modern historical period covered in the series, and perhaps ever. A real testament to how bloody, chaotic, hack and slash, and thunderous roars of gunpowder converge together in a artful Japanese setting to deliver such uniqueness, such particular individuality. It has been profoundly revered and struggled to be replicated since. As Total War evolves into greater and greater mass market appeal, as Total War moves away from its historical roots, there is an ever-increasing feeling of wistfulness about the Total Wars of old, the expansions of old, and the lesson that newer is not always necessarily better. Is Fall of the Samurai the best Total War expansion ever? In my eyes, it's a resounding yes. This was a 10-year retrospective on a Total War saga, Fall of the Samurai. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe for more, and if you want to support us further, consider subscribing on Patreon to fund more analytical videos like this for as little as $1 a month.